I feel like the best fight for both Billy Joe Saunders and Eubank Jr. potentially could be with each other. Now, obviously, Eubank Jr. is in a position where he's been talking about fighting Golovkin, and he has mentioned Billy Joe Saunders several times. But at this point in time, I just feel like is potential for Billy Joe Saunders. Obviously, he's coming off a loss to Canelo, but that, for all intents and purposes, was his biggest fight on the biggest platform in his career at this point in time. Like, regardless of what you think about him, he made almost 10 million fighting Canelo. It was a unification bout with all of the belts. Not all of the belts. Obviously, Caleb Plant has the IBF belt, but most of the belts. On top of that, he was in there against who many consider the number one pound for pound fighter in boxing. And on top of that, not only is the number one pound for pound fighter in boxing, he's also one of the most significant cash cows in boxing at this point in time. So for Billy Joe Saunders to go from that, obviously he needs to recover psychologically from what he's been through, having his eye socket smashed in. I'm not saying, obviously a lot of people have been saying that that's not even true, it's not even a real injury, but let's just pretend for this argument that it is a real injury. If that's the case, a fight between him and Eubank Jr. I think could be the next logical step. Maybe not the next logical step, but maybe a fight in 2-3 fights from now, for both Billy Joe Saunders and Eubank Jr. Now, Eubank Jr., for all intents and purposes, has not won a real world title yet. Billy Joe Saunders, regardless of what you think about him, on paper is a 2-time WBO champion, while Eubank Jr. has won an interim belt and an IBO belt, which is lightly regarded. So I feel like Eubank Jr., if he wants to put himself in a position where he's the definite A-side to Billy Joe Saunders, and let's be real, Billy Joe Saunders is the A-side in this equation because he's coming off a fight against the biggest name in boxing, which is Canelo. Eubank Jr. needs to do something that can actually put him on that level to maximize his earnings if he was to fight Billy Joe Saunders. Now, what he could do is he could fight Golovkin, which is a very risky move because I think Golovkin even now has the ability to beat Eubank Jr. Or he could fight Murata, pick up a belt. Obviously it's a risky fight because Murata's, I think he's an Olympian if I'm not mistaken, and he's got a very big following in Japan. So if he's going to go all the way to Japan to fight him, it's obvious that Murata's going to have the hometown advantage. But in terms of that perspective, I think the best chance of him winning a legitimate world title is fighting the likes of a Murata and actually going all the way to Japan and fighting him. And I think that's the most winnable chance. I don't think he's going to beat someone like Erislandy Lara. I just think Lara's just too sophisticated. Demetrius Andrade, too sophisticated. But a Murata fight could be interesting, and I think Eubank Jr. has fought away from home before in the past. So if he can win an actual legitimate belt, put his profile up as a real world champion. Billy Joe Saunders obviously is coming off a loss and he's already contemplating retirement. I think Billy Joe Saunders should come back and should fight a fighter that's not a complete no-name, but a fighter that's not quite on the level of a Canelo or on the level of a Eubank Jr. Just a rehabilitation fight, just so that he could get his confidence back. Obviously, his confidence must have been a little bit rocked after he, by all intents and purposes, quitting the ring against Canelo. So I think just getting one more win on his column would be positive for him, like for his self-confidence and his mentality. And I think at that point, I think Eubank Jr. and Billy Joe Saunders should fight each other. If Eubank Jr. can win a world title, that'd be great. If he loses, it is what it is. At least he rolled the dice and tried to win a world title. But if he does win a world title against Murata and then he goes into the ring with Billy Joe Saunders has a lot more to gain in that fight. He has a belt to gain. He's already fighting someone that he beat before, so he's going to be confident. And I think collectively, both Billy Joe Saunders versus Eubank Jr., a second fight, I'm not going to say it's going to be the biggest payday of Billy Joe Saunders' career, and it might not necessarily be the biggest payday of Eubank Jr.'s career, because Eubank Jr., when he was in his fight against Groves, for all intents and purposes, that was considered a British super fight. It was considered a very big fight at the time. It was like the semi-finals of the World Boxing Super Series. And obviously Billy Joe Saunders is coming off a fight against Canelo on the biggest stage. Canelo, the biggest pound for pound fighter. So I don't think it's going to be the biggest win on their record, biggest fight on their record for either Billy Joe Saunders or Eubank Jr. But I think it's got the potential to be top 3. I think both of them can make a couple million from this fight. So I think that's the best route that they should take. I think Billy Joe Saunders should take a rehabilitation fight, get his confidence back. And I think Eubank Jr. should win a world title against a Murata, so he brings more to the negotiation table. And then from there, Eubank Jr., if he's got a legitimate belt, which is, I think Murata's got the IBF belt if I'm not mistaken, then in the negotiations table he can actually say, listen, I've got a belt, that's something that you want. I don't know if Billy Joe Saunders wants that. He's already won 2 belts, but he definitely would want a good payday. And I think Eubank Jr., if he does get a belt, he's got more leverage in the negotiation table. Billy Joe Saunders is obviously coming off his biggest fight, not his biggest win. Imagine if he would have beaten Canelo. Jeez, his biggest fight of his career against Canelo. And I think it's a logical fight. I mean, obviously he's going to take one fight in the interim just to get his confidence back, but then fighting Eubank Jr., I think both of them can make a lot of money. And for a lot of people, there are people out there that think it was a relatively close fight, but they think Eubank Jr. was coming strong towards the end of the fight. So to some extent, if Billy Joe Saunders could beat Eubank Jr. again, then it's a conclusive victory on his part. He's already beaten him once, but just to get rid of any doubt that he's a better fighter than Eubank. And if Eubank Jr. could beat Billy Joe Saunders, then he's managed to avenge a loss. So it's a win-win situation for both of them if they were to do that. But obviously that's just my opinion, what they should do next. I think Eubank Jr. just to make his career 100% legit, and he does have good wins on his resume. Even though James DeGale was past it, that's still a name on his resume. Even though Arthur Abraham was past it, still a name on his resume. He's had a few good wins on the British circuit against Nick Blackwells of the world. I think his biggest victory in terms of generally was his fight against Avni Yildirim. He fought Avni Yildirim in his backyard and he managed to knock him out as a fighter, an away fighter as well, and it was a relatively impressive performance. I'm not saying Avni Yildirim is the best fighter in the world, but to fight a home fighter and knock him out in front of his people is quite impressive. Obviously the win against Reynold Quinlan for the IBO title, I don't really count that because Reynold Quinlan beat a Daniel Gill who's just way past it, and on top of that he only had 12 fights himself. Eubank Jr., even though he's the challenger for the title, had more fights than the champion. I mean, how often do you see that happening? So I think for all intents and purposes, the biggest win on Eubank's resume is the Avni Yildirim fight. But say what you want about Billy Joe Saunders, but I remember when he was on a tear on the British circuit and he took several fighters their undefeated record. He beat Spike O'Sullivan, took his undefeated record, Nick Blackwell. Obviously Eubank was one of them. Then he managed to win a title against the Andy Lee of the world, and then obviously went up a weight and he won a title, and he's an undefeated world champion going in there, and he lost against Canelo, who at the time was at the peak of his powers. So say what you want, but I think Billy Joe Saunders is more legitimate than Eubank. But Eubank can bring more to the negotiation table if he wins a title. If he's able to beat Golovkin, I don't know how he's going to do that, because Golovkin is still Golovkin. Even an old Golovkin is a world-class elite fighter, and he's not really lost yet. Then at that point, if he goes into a negotiations with Billy Joe Saunders after a win over Golovkin, then I think he'll be a definite A-side. Because, I mean, you get a win. Even a faded Golovkin is still a formidable fighter, but I just don't see that happening. So I think he should get a win over Murata, and then he should fight Billy Joe Saunders. Obviously, in the interim, Billy Joe Saunders will get a win over a relatively good opponent, and then from there on, I think they both should fight. And they could both make a couple million from that fight, and I think it will draw some fan interest, especially since they've been going back and forth with each other. But yeah, that's just my opinion. Tell me your opinion. What do you think should happen? Do you think Billy Joe Saunders and Eubank should have a fight, or do you think they should not have a fight? Or would you be interested in seeing a fight? Tell me below, and like and subscribe to the channel. I've got a lot more content coming your way. Peace out.